Boring history for sleep. How ancient Egyptians used onions as medicine. Imagine for a moment that you've awoken in the dusty, sun-baked land of ancient Egypt. Around 1500 BCE, the Nile stretches out like a watery spine through a world of sandstone temples, palm-lined irrigation channels, and half-constructed tombs. You are not a pharaoh, you are not a priest, you're just a farmer or perhaps a servant, rising with the sun and working with calloused hands. And yet, tucked into the folds of your day, inside your basket of barley bread and salted fish, is a round, pungent vegetable that holds a surprisingly sacred status: the onion. It is not an exotic spice. It is not rare. In fact, onions are everywhere, grown in the irrigated fields that flourish during the Nile's annual flood season. Onions are as common in the ancient Egyptian diet as bread, but onions were more than food. They were medicine, offering hope and healing in a world without antibiotics, sterile bandages, or even much understanding of germs. And they were deeply sacred, associated with life, eternity, and protection, woven into rituals and religious offerings. To the ancient Egyptians, the onion was not merely a vegetable. It was a symbol, a tool, and often a last resort. The onion's strange reputation. It may seem odd now, but in the world of early medicine, where leeches, honey, and crocodile dung were legitimate treatments, the onion was relatively advanced. This layered bulb was thought to hold protective, even magical properties. Why? Perhaps it was the concentric rings that seemed endless, symbolizing eternal life. Or perhaps it was its pungent smell, which the Egyptians believed could ward off evil spirits or illness. The Immerse Papyrus, a medical text dating to around 1550 BCE, lists hundreds of remedies, many involving onions. For sore eyes, crushed onion with honey. For heart disease, boiled onion water. For abdominal pain, onion mixed with beer and frankincense. Over 700 prescriptions exist in this text, and onions appear throughout. Their antiseptic properties, though not scientifically understood, were likely observed and noted by trial and error. Even the workers who built the pyramids, the laborers, often conscripted peasants, were given rations of onions, garlic, and radishes, not simply for nourishment, but because these foods were believed to offer strength, vitality, and protection. Some hieroglyphs suggest that the pyramid workers were nearly ready to revolt when their onion rations were disrupted. A medical treatment, a godly symbol, a worker's fuel. In ancient Egypt, the onion was all of these and more. Onions in death and the afterlife. If onions were used in life to promote health, they were also used in death to promote rebirth. Mummification was a complex process requiring 70 days of work, and a variety of pungent substances: natron salts to dry the body, resin to preserve the skin, linen to wrap it all up. But among the final layers of linen, tucked into crevices of the corpse, you might also find onions. Some mummies have been discovered with onions placed in their eye sockets or over their chest cavities. Why? The reasons aren't entirely clear, but many Egyptologists believe the onions were symbolic. They may have represented the eyes or breath of the gods, providing the deceased with sight or life in the next world. The smell, too, may have been used to purify the body or ward off evil spirits that might seek to desecrate it. One famous case is that of Ramesses IV, a pharaoh who ruled in the 12th century BCE. His mummified body was found to have onion rings placed in his eye sockets, a detail that caught the attention of archaeologists and historians alike. These weren't accidental. They were carefully positioned, evidence of a belief that the onion offered more than earthly healing. It could guide a soul through the perilous journey to the afterlife. In a society where death was never the end, the onion was more than a food. It was a companion for the voyage beyond. Harvest and labor. Now step out of the temples and tombs and into the hot, hard soil of the Nile Delta. You are a farmer, working with your family in a strip of land that's just recovered from the floodwaters. The silt is rich, dark, and full of life. This is the only time of year to plant onions. They're hardy, easy to grow, and thrive in Egypt's alluvial plains. Harvesting onions is dull, back-breaking work. You bend, dig, pull. Each bulb is covered in the same chalky dust. You bunch them together, hang them to dry in the shade of your mud brick home, and then store them in woven baskets, sometimes even underground to keep them cool. If you're fortunate, you can sell them in the marketplace, where they're traded alongside cumin, coriander, and dried dates. For the average Egyptian, onions are cheap and useful. They are eaten raw with flatbread, chopped into stews, or added to beer, but they're also dried, powdered, and boiled for remedies. Your grandmother might insist on an onion compress for a fever, or boiled onion water for stomach cramps. It is medicine by tradition, passed down through generations. No one has a full explanation for why it works, but they've seen it work. Sacred or stinky. There's a curious duality in how ancient Egyptians viewed onions. On one hand, they were sacred. Priests would offer them at temple altars. Onions appeared in artwork, tomb reliefs, and votive offerings. In the story of the gods, onions played a symbolic role. Eternal layers, everlasting breath. But on the other hand, onions were considered unclean for certain rituals. Some high priests avoided them during purification periods, perhaps because of their strong odor or because of taboos around bodily emissions. The exact reasons are lost, but it shows that even then, the onion's smell was a source of debate. How can something be both sacred and vulgar? Revered and restricted? It's a contradiction that reflects a broader theme in Egyptian medicine and religion. Nothing is purely one thing. Every substance, every object, could be both cure and curse, depending on its use, timing, and spiritual alignment. A daily life reconstructed. Let's return now to daily life. Imagine a healer, a lay physician, not a priest, walking through a village with a woven satchel. Inside, linen bandages, a small jar of honey, some beer, a bronze knife, and onions. Lots of onions, crushed, pickled, dried, or raw. They are used for everything from fevers to fractures. The healer stops to see an elderly woman with swollen joints. He mixes mashed onion with castor oil and applies it to her knees. At another home, a child with a sore throat is given a syrup of boiled onion and dates. No anesthesia, no lab tests. Just observation, repetition, and a bit of hope. These treatments didn't always work, but sometimes they did. And over centuries, these successes, whether chemical or coincidental, built a system of belief in the healing power of something as humble as an onion. So, as you drift through the rhythms of this ancient world, surrounded by sun-hardened bricks and the slow churn of river and sand, you begin to wonder, how did the people of the Nile know what worked? Were their onion-based treatments based on real results, or merely the best options they had? And if onions were so central to their health and spiritual life, what else might be hiding in the dust of ancient medicine, quietly shaping survival? Temples, trials, and the onion's role in early science. We return now to the dry air of ancient Egypt, to the labyrinthine temples and humble homes nestled between the shifting sands and the steady pulse of the Nile. If the onion was a staple in everyday life, it was also at the heart of something much grander, the emerging science of healing. In this land of gods and floods, of granite monuments and eternal tombs, medicine was not separate from spirituality, and yet within this system, there existed a slow, deliberate movement toward understanding the body, a science born from patterns, from observation, and from plants like the onion. It wasn't a modern science, but it was a start. The temple healers and the wisdom of the onion in ancient Egypt. Healing was often the work of priests. The most respected were the Subw, a class of physician priests who operated out of temples, especially those dedicated to Thoth, the god of wisdom, and Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of healing and plague. These SW&W were not experimenting wildly. Instead, they followed protocols, chants, and treatments passed down from centuries before, often documented on papyrus scrolls in script both practical and mystical. In the temples, medicine and magic were inseparable. Illness could be caused by a god's anger, a demonic spirit, or an imbalance in the body's fluids. What we might now interpret as the earliest glimmers of pathology. The treatments might include recited prayers, sacred amulets, and sometimes a carefully applied onion salve. If a patient complained of stomach cramps, the healer might consult a scroll, recite a protective incantation, and then prepare a mixture of boiled onion, coriander, and beer. This was then consumed sometimes multiple times a day. In cases of skin infection, onion mash would be pressed into wounds, likely because it stung and created the sensation of something happening. It may also have helped unknowingly killing bacteria thanks to sulfur compounds in the onion. At the intersection of belief and biology, the onion thrived. The Immerse Papyrus, Egypt's medical handbook. One of the most astonishing windows into this world is the Immerse Papyrus, a sprawling medical text that stretches over 100 pages and includes more than 700 remedies. Copied during the reign of Amenhotep I around 1550 BCE, the papyrus is not a collection of spells, but a detailed manual, symptoms, observations, instructions. Here, onions are listed not as religious artifacts, but as tools. Remedies call for onion mixed with goose fat for earaches. For respiratory issues, a healer might blend onions with incense and inhale the fumes. For digestive troubles, onions could be consumed raw, cooked, or soaked in beer. The repetition of onion-based treatments across this papyrus suggests that results were being observed. The process wasn't yet scientific in the way we define it today. There was no formal method of controlled trials, but there was a logic. Try, record, repeat. When something seemed to help more often than not, it remained in the practice. When it didn't, it faded. Medicine was slow, but medicine was real. Laborers and survival. Why onions mattered to the working class beyond the temples and scrolls, beyond the linen-wrapped mummies and sacred rites. There was the day-to-day survival of laborers, men and women whose bodies bore the cost of Egypt's greatness. These were the brick makers, the canal diggers, the tomb painters, and above all, the pyramid builders. The idea that the pyramids were built by slaves has long since been dismissed by archaeologists. Instead, they were built by conscripted workers, peasants, who spent a few months a year working on state projects as a form of taxation. In exchange, they received housing, beer, bread, and onions. Archaeological excavations at workers' villages near the Giza Plateau have turned up mass quantities of onion remains, layers of skins, dried bulbs, and preserved plant matter, buried under millennia of dust. These onions weren't just food. They were the closest thing to a health insurance plan. Workers believed onions kept their strength up, improved their breathing, and protected them from the ailments that came from dust, strain, and the proximity of many bodies in close quarters. It's possible that they were right. Onions contain quercetin, a compound with anti-inflammatory and antihistamine properties. They also contain a lichen, which has antimicrobial effects. In a laborer's world, before hand washing, before antiseptic, any food with such properties could make the difference between a lingering illness and recovery. So when onions stopped being delivered to the workers at Giza, there was a near revolt. According to some interpretations of ostraca, ancient scraps of limestone or pottery used as notebooks, officials had to restore onion rations quickly to keep peace. The government may have overseen granaries and temple offerings, but it learned not to mess with the onion supply. Women healers and household remedies. Although men held formal roles in temples and state-run clinics, women in ancient Egypt were often the primary caregivers in the home. They were midwives, herbalists, and healers in their own right. passing down recipes and rituals through generations. Their knowledge was rarely written down, but their work sustained families. In the Ai household, the onion was a remedy of first resort. Women used onions for fertility issues. Some texts suggest onions were placed near a woman's genitals overnight to determine fertility based on smell the next morning. Contraception. Mixtures of onions and dates inserted vaginally were believed to prevent pregnancy. Menstrual regulation. Onion water was consumed to provoke or delay menstruation depending on need. Some of these practices sound strange, even disturbing to modern ears, but they reflect an empirical effort to understand the body with the tools at hand. Women experimented, learned from results, and shared their knowledge, and the onion was at the center of many such experiments. The onion abroad. How Egyptian practices spread. By the time the Greeks began trading and eventually settling in parts of Egypt, including Alexandria, they were struck by the complexity of Egyptian medical knowledge. Greek physicians like Herodotus and later Galen observed and in some cases adopted Egyptian methods. Hippocrates, known as the father of medicine, referred to treatments that included onions and garlic as basic dietary staples for health. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he brought with him a scientific culture that would soon merge with Egyptian tradition. The Great Library of Alexandria, though focused on philosophy and mathematics, housed medical texts that combined Greek and Egyptian ideas. The onion became a cross-cultural medicine, seen in Roman texts, medieval, Arabic manuals, and eventually in Renaissance herbals. By then it had lost some of its sacred mystery, but retained its reputation as a powerful, natural remedy. What began in the Nile's floodplains spread through conquest and scholarship to the rest of the Mediterranean world. Skepticism and the seeds of change. Of course, not everyone believed in onion cures. There were skeptics even in ancient Egypt. Some questioned the over-reliance on smell and symbolism in treatment. A few medical papyri include critiques of excessive magic or poorly understood ingredients. As Egyptian society progressed through the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and into the Ptolemaic period, some healers began focusing more on anatomy and less on magic. Dissections, mostly of animals, and battlefield injuries provided opportunities to study the body more closely, and yet through all these changes the onion remained. Perhaps because it worked just enough, perhaps because it symbolized a bridge between science and superstition, between daily life and divine power. The onion's long shadow in Egyptian healing raises a quiet question. Did this ancient bulb truly heal? Or was its power born in belief alone? And if onions were considered vital to survival, what else did the Egyptians trust with equal faith? Whether or not it actually worked. The onion's legacy. From tomb offerings to modern pharmacology. So far, we've explored the onion as both food and medicine in the daily life and religious fabric of ancient Egypt. We've watched it appear on the palates of priests, in the pockets of pyramid laborers, and between the hands of homebound healers. Yet the story does not end in the dusty scrolls of the Ebers Papyrus or in the humble kitchens of Memphis and Thebes. The final chapter of the Egyptian onion is not simply one of disappearance, but transformation, of legacy. The onion left its imprint on burial rites, on pharmacological traditions, and even on modern understandings of nutrition and antimicrobial properties. To understand how it endured, we must look at the onion not only as a symbol or a staple, but as a case study in how early civilizations preserved knowledge, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, and how that knowledge echoes forward, even when its origins are forgotten. Tombs of the onion, preserved in eternity. When the tomb of Tutankhamun was opened in 1922 by Howard Carter, among the golden masks and ivory daggers were seemingly mundane artifacts, linen tunics, broken pottery, a board game, seeds, and onions. real, shriveled, desiccated onions, placed carefully at various points in the burial chamber. Some were found near the boy king's pelvis and in his chest cavity, probably placed during embalming. Others were in small baskets or jars, preserved in the cool, dry darkness for over 3,000 years. Why onions? Because the Egyptians believed they had spiritual as well as medicinal power. Their concentric circles symbolized eternity, the afterlife, and the cyclical nature of rebirth. To the Egyptians, this wasn't metaphor. It was functional. The soul would need sustenance and protection on its long journey through the underworld, and the onion, capable of feeding the body and warding off disease, was a logical companion. In fact, onions appear in dozens of tombs, not just those of royalty. Artifacts from the Middle Kingdom show onions wrapped in burial cloths, painted on offering tables, and carved into wall reliefs. Their presence in tombs is evidence of their social and symbolic weight, every bit as significant as gold or lapis lazuli, just not as glamorous to the modern eye. But the Egyptians weren't preserving onions as mere decor. They were preserving a system of belief and a kind of memory. Onion myths and afterlives. By the late period of Egyptian history, roughly 664 to 332 BCE, the role of onions in ritual and medicine began to fade. Foreign powers, first the Persians, then the Greeks, and eventually the Romans, absorbed and altered Egyptian customs. Some historians suggest that the religious associations of onions were deliberately muted by foreign rulers who saw them as odd or impure. The Greeks, for example, respected Egyptian medicine but regarded many of its religious rites with skepticism. To them, a pungent bulb as a sacred object was an eccentricity, not an icon. Still, some Egyptian beliefs about onions crept into broader Mediterranean folklore. In Greek homes, onions were sometimes hung by the door to ward off evil spirits. Roman soldiers consumed onions before battle, convinced of their strengthening powers. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, listed onion remedies for everything, from toothaches to sleep disorders, echoing the same treatments found in papyri centuries earlier. Thus, the onion's legacy endured, diluted and disguised, in new contexts. The form changed, but the substance remained. Medieval and Islamic preservation of Egyptian onion lore. As the classical world crumbled and Europe descended into what is often called the Dark Ages, Egypt once again became a hub of preserved knowledge. Not through its temples or tombs this time, but through the Islamic Golden Age. From the 8th to 13th centuries, scholars in Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus translated ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman medical texts into Arabic. They added their own observations, built hospitals, and wrote treatises that synthesized knowledge across centuries and cultures. In Islamic medicine, onions maintained their medicinal profile. Scholars like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Al-Razi recorded onion-based treatments for fevers, infections, and breathing difficulties. They didn't always cite their Egyptian sources explicitly, but the parallels are striking. In some cases, the exact same combinations, onion and honey, onion and vinegar, onion poultices, appear in both Egyptian and Arabic texts. What this means is that the Egyptian onion tradition didn't die. It simply changed languages. Even today, many traditional healing systems across the Middle East and North Africa incorporate onions, grated, boiled, soaked, or burned. The belief in its purifying properties and its ability to draw out illness remains alive, though few remember its pharaonic roots. Modern science and the rediscovery of ancient wisdom. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries that Western science began to rigorously study the properties of onions. With the rise of microbiology, researchers started isolating the compounds responsible for the onion's pungency and its medicinal effects. The most significant of these are allicin, created when an onion is chopped or crushed, Allicin has antimicrobial properties that can kill or inhibit bacteria and fungi. Quercetin, a flavonoid with anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and antihistamine effects. Sulfur compounds. These support detoxification processes in the liver and have mild blood-thinning properties, which may improve circulation. Clinical studies now support many of the claims made by ancient Egyptian healers. Onion extracts have been shown to reduce blood pressure, lower cholesterol, and support immune function. While no one suggests onions are miracle cures, they are now regarded as one of the functional foods with real, measurable health benefits. What's remarkable is that modern laboratories have, in many ways, validated the trial and error practices of ancient Subw and herbalists. Their insights, born of observation and oral tradition, anticipated discoveries we now attribute to scientific innovation. The difference is the method. The insight in many cases was already there. From kitchen staple to cultural artifact today, onions are among the most consumed vegetables in the world. They are the base for broths, sauces, stews, and stir-fries on nearly every continent. Most people chop them without thinking. Few reflect on the history carried in every translucent layer, but that history is there. Every time you caramelize onions, you are participating in a process older than iron smelting. Every time you lay a sliced onion on a wound or inhale steam from boiling bulbs when you're sick, you're part of an ancient global tradition of healing, one that crosses cultures, religions, and empires. In Egypt itself, onions remain a staple. In rural areas, people still cook with onions in ways not unlike their ancestors 4,000 years ago. In some villages, old wives' remedies involving onion poultices or syrups persist, not because of nostalgia, but because they work well enough to survive. And in museums from Cairo to London, shriveled onions from tombs are displayed alongside jewelry and weapons. Most visitors walk past them quickly. They seem unremarkable, even silly. But in the context of Egyptian civilization, they were essential, not just for life, but for death, for healing, for memory. Final reflections. The humble power of the unremarkable. The story of how ancient Egyptians used onions as medicine is not one of dramatic breakthroughs or heroic inventors. It is a story of persistence, of tiny patterns noticed over generations, of human beings doing the best they could with what they had. It is a story of women in kitchens, of priests in smoky temples, of laborers surviving long days under a punishing sun. It is the story of how a pungent, tear-inducing bulb became a symbol of eternity, a vessel of health and a staple of survival. And it reminds us that sometimes the most ordinary things are the ones that endure the longest, not because they are flashy or perfect, but because they are useful, adaptable, and quietly powerful. So the next time you slice into an onion, you might pause, not just for the sting in your eyes, but for the history at your fingertips. What other forgotten objects of ancient life carried such weight, silently shaping human survival across millennia, waiting to be rediscovered one layer at a time? The Salt Roads. How salt quietly built civilizations. The silent trade. Salt before empires. You probably don't think much about salt. It's on your table, in your food, possibly on the sidewalk in winter. But there was a time when salt was as precious as gold, not because it was rare, but because it was essential. Utterly, profoundly essential to the survival of every human body, and eventually, every human settlement. This is the story of how salt, quiet, crystalline, and unassuming, helped shape the course of history. Long before empires were built, long before armies marched or currencies were minted, people followed salt. Not always consciously, not always deliberately, but almost always without fail. Wherever salt was, civilization followed. In this first section, we'll explore the early history of salt, how it was discovered, why it mattered so much, and how its quiet trade routes form the invisible skeleton of early societies. Salt and the human body. To understand why salt mattered, you have to understand the body. The average adult contains about 250 grams of salt, roughly the amount in a large salt shaker. This salt isn't just seasoning, it's essential. Sodium and chloride ions help transmit nerve impulses, regulate blood pressure, and maintain the balance of fluids in and out of cells. Without salt, you die, slowly and unpleasantly. Early humans understood this, not biochemically, but experientially. After intense sweating, through labor or heat or illness, they craved salty things. Hunters noticed that animals often licked certain rocks or soil patches obsessively. Salt licks, we call them now. The behavior of animals often guided human movement, and where the antelope went, so did early humans, often toward salt. The discovery of salt. No one invented salt. It was simply discovered over and over again, sometimes as white, crunchy crystals around the rim of a dried lake bed, sometimes in the pinkish slabs chipped from rocky cliffs, sometimes in the burnt residue left from boiling seawater. By the time Homo sapiens began forming permanent settlements, salt had already become more than a biological need. It was a preservative, a tool, a form of control. At some point, someone realized that meat covered in salt lasted longer. Fish too, and vegetables. Salt slowed decay immensely. This discovery extended the life of food and, in a way, of people. You could now store surplus. You could prepare for drought or winter. You could support a growing population. With preservation came storage. With storage came trade, and with trade came civilization. Salt in prehistoric life in Neolithic times, around 6000 BCE, humans were already collecting salt in deliberate ways. Evidence from sites like Lunca in Romania and Solnitsata in Bulgaria, sometimes called the oldest town in Europe, shows extensive salt production. Archaeologists have found ceramic vessels used to boil salty spring water, producing cakes of salt that could be stored or traded. Why here? Because Bulgaria's coast is near briny springs, places where underground salt deposits met surface water. Salt could be gathered year-round. The people who lived there weren't kings or priests. They were workers, salt makers, quietly producing one of the most valuable substances in the ancient world. Their settlements often became regional hubs, even without agriculture or metal tools. A community with access to salt could wield enormous influence. This wasn't unique to Europe. In ancient China, salt harvesting began at least as early as 6000 BCE in the area around Lake Yuncheng. There, early Chinese communities used brine wells and solar evaporation to gather salt. Later, they would develop some of the world's most advanced salt technologies, including deep drilling methods centuries ahead of their time. In Africa, near present-day Ethiopia, archaeological findings suggest that prehistoric salt mining began over 5,000 years ago in the Afar Depression. Salt slabs, sometimes used as currency, were carried on camel caravans across vast distances, traded for grain, textiles, or metal tools. Salt, it seems, always drew a crowd. The first salt roads as trade expanded, so did the need for regular routes. These weren't formal roads in the modern sense. There were no stone pavements or road signs. But the idea of a way to get from salt to people and back again was universal. In Europe, early salt roads connected brine-producing areas in Austria, Germany, and France to distant farming communities. The Celtic Hallstatt culture, famous for its elaborate burials and fine bronze work, was built quite literally on a salt mine. Deep within the mountains of Austria, workers dug tunnels through salt-rich rock, carving out wealth one pick stroke at a time. Their salt wasn't just a trade good. It was a source of cultural power. The Hallstatt mine produced so much salt that it enabled surplus food storage, trade networks stretching across Europe, and a thriving artisan class. Farther east, in the Himalayas, salt was carried by yaks and traders down narrow mountain passes to the plains of Nepal and India. In West Africa, the Tagaza salt mines would one day supply entire empires. Even in the Americas, the Salinas de las Barrancas in what is now Mexico provided a vital source of salt for pre-Columbian societies. But all this came later. What's important to remember is that before there were official cities, kingdoms, or armies, there were already people walking for salt, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. They didn't think of themselves as forming empires. They were just following the mineral that made life last longer. Salt is early currency. In several early societies, salt functioned as currency, not metaphorically, but literally. In ancient Ethiopia, salt slabs called amoli were used for trade as recently as the 20th century. In Roman times, soldiers were often given a salt allowance known as a salarium, the root of the word salary. While the phrase "worth his salt" is apocryphal, it reflects a truth. Salt and labor were deeply intertwined. Salt was portable, divisible, and non-perishable. In that way, it shared many traits with money. But unlike gold, it was also necessary for life. To withhold salt was not just to control wealth. It was to control survival. Some rulers understood this with brutal clarity. In ancient China, salt was one of the first state monopolies. Control the salt and you control the people. This theme would play out again and again in history, from Roman laws to French salt taxes and even Gandhi's famous Salt March. But that comes later in our story. For now, imagine a traveler in 3000 BCE. His sandals dusty, his pack heavy with mineral cakes, his journey not glamorous but vital. Perhaps he is trading for dried figs, perhaps for copper, perhaps just for grain. But wherever he walks, a road is forming, a salt road, invisible but real, and through those paths history is beginning to stir. How did these invisible salt roads begin to shape the rise of early cities, empires, and laws? And what happened when salt became a tool of power rather than survival? Salt and power, from taxation to empire. By the time early cities rose from mud and mortar in Mesopotamia, salt had already been doing quiet work for thousands of years. It had drawn people into communities, created trade routes, and helped preserve food in climates that otherwise threatened survival. But what began as a necessity of life would gradually become a tool of wealth, of governance, of power. In this section, we'll travel through the growing cities of the ancient world and into the bureaucracies that began to crystallize around the control of salt. From Mesopotamia to China, from Rome to Timbuktu, the once humble mineral now found itself wrapped in laws, levies, and revolts. Salt and the first cities. Let's begin with Sumer. In the city of Ur, one of the earliest major urban centers, circa 2100 BCE, records etched into clay tablets reveal details about food rations, market transactions, and trade obligations. Among these cuneiform inscriptions are references to salt, measurements, values, and exchanges. Salt was not just a seasoning, it was a rationed good, distributed to laborers alongside grain and beer. In some cases, temple bureaucracies controlled salt storage, keeping careful accounts of inflows and outflows, just as they did with barley or oil. Control of salt, then, wasn't incidental. It was administrative. Religious temples, which doubled as economic centers, ensured a reliable supply, and collected it as tribute. As cities grew more complex, the handling of salt mirrored the handling of other staples, but with a difference. Salt couldn't be grown. It had to be harvested, transported, or mined. This meant cities far from natural salt sources had to rely on long-distance trade, and whoever controlled that trade, whether a caravan master, a temple authority, or a king, had leverage. The salt bureaucracy of ancient China. Few civilizations understood the political potential of salt, better than the Chinese. By the time of the Western Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 9 CE, salt production had become both technologically advanced and highly regulated. The Chinese state, particularly under Emperor Wu, established an official salt monopoly. Private producers were taxed heavily, and salt wells, pans, and boiling stations became state assets. This wasn't arbitrary. Salt was chosen for control precisely because everyone needed it. A tax on salt was a tax that couldn't easily be avoided. You could skip buying silk or porcelain. You couldn't skip salt. The state used salt revenues to fund infrastructure, armies, and bureaucracy. By the Tang Dynasty, 7th-10th century CE, salt taxes accounted for as much as half of all imperial income. The monopoly was so entrenched that private salt merchants operated in a kind of shadow economy. Smuggling and illicit sales were punishable by death, yet persisted for centuries. Salt officials appointed by the emperor traveled the country auditing salt stations, inspecting warehouses, and managing distribution routes. Their records were meticulous. Like the priests of Ur, they understood that to track salt was to track people, wealth, and power. What's striking is how durable this system was. For over 2,000 years, the salt monopoly shaped Chinese governance. It provided financial ballast through dynastic changes and served as an example to other states seeking stable revenue without land seizures or forced labor. Rome's salarium, pay, and policy. Meanwhile, in the West, Rome was also building an empire, and salt was never far from its mind. Roman soldiers, as you may know, were issued rations of salt, but more than that, their salarium, from which we get the word salary, was originally linked to this essential good. There is scholarly debate about whether salarium was paid in salt directly or in coin intended for buying salt, but the connection remains. Romans built Via Salaria, the salt road, to transport salt from the Adriatic coast to Rome itself. This road was not merely for commerce, it was strategic. Salt fed Rome's population and its armies. Maintaining control over supply routes ensured both stability and dominance. In provinces, salt works were often seized and administered by Roman governors. Salt was taxed, regulated, and stored in official granaries. Like grain, it was part of the logistical foundation of empire. Roman law included regulations about salt purity, sale weights, and fraud prevention. In the wider Mediterranean, Roman traders carried salt to North Africa, Gaul, and Britain. At the same time, they imported salt-cured goods, especially fish and meat, from Spain and Carthage. In essence, salt helped hold the Roman world together. Not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. When you needed to move food, fund campaigns, or prevent famine, salt was there. The salt gold trade of Africa far to the south, in the Sahara and Sahel regions of Africa, salt had a different kind of power. It was traded for gold. In the medieval period, the trans-Saharan trade routes connected salt miners in the north with gold producers in the forests of West Africa. Cities like Takaza, Taudeni, and Bilma produced salt by evaporating briny water or mining desert crust. The slabs, sometimes weighing up to 90 pounds, were carried on camelback in long caravans across unforgiving terrain. Southward, cities like Gao, Djenné, and most famously Timbuktu were centers of gold production and scholarship. The exchange was simple but profound. Salt for gold. It's been said that in some areas salt was more valuable than gold because it was needed daily. The empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai grew rich by taxing this trade. They didn't need to produce the salt themselves. They simply controlled the crossings, rivers, oases, and trade junctions. In this way, the desert became a corridor of wealth. Silent, sun-baked, deadly, but humming with caravans, each carrying slabs of salt that would flavor and preserve meals hundreds of miles away, and in return, bring back coin, gold dust, or manuscripts. The story of Mansa Musa, the famed emperor of Mali who distributed so much gold during his pilgrimage to Mecca that it devalued gold across North Africa, is better known. Less remembered is that much of his wealth came from his control over salt gold trade. Salt made cities rise from sand. Salt made rulers, and salt paid for books, mosques, and libraries that still stand today. The salt taxes of France and the revolts they sparked. While salt built wealth, it also bred resentment, especially when controlled by force. In France, the gabelle was a tax on salt imposed in the 14th century. It began as a temporary wartime measure, but, like many taxes, became permanent. Different regions paid different rates, some outrageously high, others almost nothing. This inequity sowed anger. To make things worse, the monarchy made salt purchases mandatory. Every household had to buy a certain amount of salt per year even if they didn't need it. The result? Smuggling, hoarding, and periodic revolts. By the 17th and 18th centuries, fauconniers, salt smugglers, became both a criminal class and a folk hero category. They tunneled under walls, disguised wagons, bribed officials. Entire communities turned a blind eye to the smuggling trade. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the gabelle was one of the taxes most hated by the common people. It symbolized not just economic burden but injustice. The revolutionaries abolished it, temporarily, but salt taxes returned under Napoleon and persisted in some form well into the 20th century. Salt, once the builder of civilizations, had become a symbol of oppressive bureaucracy. The common thread, what unites all these stories, China's monopoly, Rome's salarium, Africa's salt gold trade, and France's gabelle, is a simple truth. Salt gave rulers leverage over people. Because salt is essential, it cannot be optional. Because it cannot be easily substituted, it cannot be easily escaped. And because it is durable, portable, and valuable in small quantities, it lends itself to storage, taxation, and control. Unlike grain, it does not spoil. Unlike gold, it is not purely symbolic. It lives in that rare space between daily necessity and long-term wealth. And in that space, law and policy have always hovered. Salt is not dramatic, but it is powerful. It doesn't shout, it endures. What happens when that quiet endurance of salt begins to shift the course of modern politics? And how did salt help spark revolutions in both East and West? Salt and revolution. The mineral that defied empires. By now you've seen how salt nourished the early cities, funded empires, and became a bureaucratic tool. It was taxed, transported, guarded, and fought over. But what happens when the control of salt crosses a certain threshold? When the tax is too steep, the policy too rigid, the grip too tight? Salt, so often invisible in the great narratives of conquest and revolution, has quietly played a catalytic role in the unraveling of power too. From the dusty plains of colonial India to the last gasps of European monarchies, salt moved from economic foundation to revolutionary symbol. Let's walk a little farther down the salt roads, where the trail becomes a march, and the grains themselves begin to whisper dissent. Gandhi's salt market began with a simple law. In British India, only the colonial government could legally produce or sell salt. Indians were forbidden from making it even from seawater evaporated under the sun, a resource freely available along India's vast coast. This was not merely economic policy, it was psychological control. Salt was part of the Indian diet, a daily necessity, and to make people pay for what they could easily harvest felt, to many, like a kind of theft. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi, now emerging as the face of Indian resistance, chose this quiet injustice to launch a national act of civil disobedience. He began the Salt March, a 240-mile walk from Sabarmati Ashram to the Arabian Sea, accompanied by 78 followers, most of them young men. The goal? To defy British law by making salt from seawater. Day by day, the march grew. Villagers emerged to offer food. Journalists took notes. Children waved flags. By the time Gandhi reached the coastal village of Dandi, tens of thousands were watching. On April 6, 1930, he stooped, picked up a small lump of natural salt, and held it aloft. It was a profoundly uneventful moment. There were no drums, no blood, no gunfire, and yet it shook the foundations of the British Raj. The Salt March sparked widespread protests. Across the country, people began making their own salt. British police arrested over 60,000 people. Gandhi himself was taken into custody weeks later. Why salt? Gandhi could have chosen textile taxes or land seizures. But salt had something special. It was small, understandable, essential. By choosing it, he made the rebellion personal. Something every Indian could participate in. The British, trying to maintain control, inadvertently magnified the symbolism. Raids on salt makers made headlines. Images of peaceful protesters beaten with batons went global. In the end, the Salt March didn't overthrow the British Empire, but it did change the game. It proved that peaceful resistance could be powerful, that civil disobedience could be national, and that salt could be more than a seasoning. It could be a statement. American Salt Works in the Civil War. On the other side of the world, salt had already played its part in another great upheaval, the American Civil War. When war broke out in 1861, both the Union and Confederate sides quickly realized they would need to control vital supplies. Railroads, rivers, gunpowder, and yes, salt. In the Confederate South, salt was essential for preserving meat, especially for feeding armies far from home. Without refrigeration, soldiers relied on salted pork and beef, packed in barrels and carted to the UN front. Civilian populations too depended on salt for survival. The Union, recognizing this, began targeting southern salt works. One of the largest was at Saltville, Virginia, where salt brine was boiled in great iron kettles day and night. When Union troops raided the site in 1864, they knew exactly what they were doing. The destruction of Saltville was not symbolic. It was strategic. Destroy the salt supply and you starve the army. Other salt works in Georgia, Louisiana, and Florida met similar fates. In some towns, the price of salt rose astronomically. In Richmond, it was said that a pound of salt cost more than a pound of butter, and salt riots erupted in some cities. Ironically, many Southerners returned to old methods. Boiling seawater over wood fires. Women and children gathered brine and watched the long, slow evaporation in cast iron pans. In wartime, salt returned to its roots, not as a commodity, but as a necessity of survival. And for the Confederacy, its scarcity was a quiet but decisive blow. The long life of the salt monopoly. You might assume that as modern states industrialized, salt would lose its economic gravity. And in many ways it did. Refrigeration, railroads, and chemical preservatives reduced its strategic importance, but salt monopolies proved stubborn. In France, though the hated gabelle was abolished during the French Revolution, it was reinstated by Napoleon and survived well into the 20th century. It wasn't fully repealed until 1945, long after many French citizens thought they were free of it. In China, the salt monopoly outlived emperors and dynasties. Even into the Republican era of the 20th century, salt taxes remained a cornerstone of government revenue. Foreign powers too got involved. Britain, France, and the U.S. all demanded control over salt revenue during the chaotic years of warlordism and foreign debt. It wasn't until 1949, with the founding of the People's Republic of China, that the salt monopoly was officially dismantled. Even then, vestiges remained. Government control of salt distribution, at least in part, persisted into the 21st century. Salt, today, invisible but still present. Today, Salt sits in your kitchen cabinet, largely unconsidered. You sprinkle it on your eggs, toss it in a pot of boiling water. At restaurants it arrives in small glass shakers or ceramic bowls. Cheap, ordinary, forgotten, and yet salt is still mined, traded, and regulated. Massive salt mines in Poland, Pakistan, and Canada produce thousands of tons per day. Road salt, used to melt ice, is a major government expense in cold climates. In fact, many municipalities maintain salt reserves like they would oil or grain. In some parts of the world, salt is still used in rituals, ceremonies, and medicine. It's used to preserve fish in Norway, to clean wounds in rural clinics, and to purify temples in Japan. But more than that, salt has left a residue on language, culture, and politics. The word salary still ties us to salt. To be worth your salt means to be competent. A salt-of-the-earth person is honest, grounded. In ancient times, treaties were sometimes sealed with salt. In the Hebrew Bible, there's the covenant of salt, symbolizing permanence. Salt remains in our blood, our sweat, our tears. You carry about a quarter pound of salt in your body right now. Without it, your nerves wouldn't fire, your muscles wouldn't contract, and your heart wouldn't beat. It is, in every sense, essential. Quiet conclusion: salt did not change the world in sudden strokes. It did not conquer nations nor invent new tools. It did not discover electricity or fuel an industrial age. Instead, it sat in the background, quiet, constant, unglamorous. It funded armies, fed cities, sparked revolts, and paid salaries. It built empires and toppled them, one grain at a time. It is not a hero in the story of human history nor a villain, but it may be one of its most enduring characters. Perhaps that is the greatest testament to salt's power, that we barely notice it anymore. When the world is built not on heroes or battles, but on food, trade, and necessity, how many other invisible forces have shaped us just like salt? Would you like to continue to Story 3, The Onion Healers of Egypt? How a humble vegetable became sacred. Bulbs and burial. Onions in the tombs of pharaohs. You may not think of onions when you imagine ancient Egypt. More likely your thoughts wander to golden tombs, pyramids, and hieroglyph-covered temples. Yet beneath the grandeur, among the linen and papyrus hidden behind the ceremonial masks and incense, there is something more mundane, but just as telling: the common onion. In tombs, on altars, wrapped with the mummified dead, and drawn in quiet corners of temple walls, the onion made repeated, sometimes reverent appearances, not as decoration or garnish, but as a cure, a symbol, a sacred object, and even as sustenance for the afterlife. This is the story of how a tear-inducing bulb became indispensable in medicine, faith, and everyday life in ancient Egypt. It is, like much of history, a quiet story, one rooted in long-forgotten rituals, surviving scribes' notes, and the slow rot of time. Let us go back to a civilization built on the Nile, where onions were more than food. They were believed to hold the secrets of health, eternity, and divine order. The onion in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians took the afterlife seriously, obsessively so. Tombs were carefully constructed, filled with food, tools, and tokens to sustain the soul on its journey to the underworld. Priests intoned spells from the Book of the Dead. Embalmers spent weeks preserving the body, and alongside amulets and linen strips, they placed onions, not garlic, not lentils, not leeks, onions. When Ramses IV, a pharaoh of the 12th century BCE, was unearthed in modern times, archaeologists found onions placed in his eye sockets and around his body. Their presence wasn't random. The Egyptians believed that the strong scent of onions had mystical properties: protective, purifying, and enduring. Like the circles of the onion itself, endless and layered, so too was the journey of the soul. According to Pliny the Elder, writing centuries later, Egyptians even swore oaths upon onions, a sign of how deeply they believed in its power. But why Onions? One theory is that onions symbolized eternal life because of their concentric rings. Their layers were viewed as a metaphor for the eternal cycle. Birth, death, rebirth. The vegetable had no clear beginning or end, much like the path of the ka, or soul. Some scholars also believe the onion's strong antiseptic properties were recognized even in rudimentary ways. Preserved onions found in tombs were often intact, a testament to their longevity. Others suggest that the pungency of the onion repelled evil spirits or helped mask the scent of decay, aiding the embalmers in their sacred duty. Whatever the reason, their place in tombs was not decorative. They were part of the ritual, woven, sometimes literally, into the fabric of the dead, food, medicine, and a daily ritual. The Egyptians were among the earliest documented civilizations to write about medicinal plants. Onions featured prominently in these early medical texts. The Ebers Papyrus, a 110-page scroll dating to around 1550 BCE, is among the oldest preserved medical documents. It contains hundreds of remedies, including many involving onions. Crushed onion with honey was prescribed for sore throats. Boiled onion water was given for digestive issues. Onions with dates and beer, a treatment for infertility. To modern ears, this may sound unscientific, but onions do have proven antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. Sulfur compounds in onions are known to help fight infections. The Egyptians, through long observation and experimentation, may have stumbled upon these traits millennia before microscopes confirmed them. Onions were eaten raw, cooked, or dried. They were crushed into pastes, steeped into decoctions, and applied to wounds. Their use spanned every level of society, from royal physicians to village midwives. Onions were cheap, abundant, and required little preparation. In fact, among the workers who built the pyramids, onions were part of the daily ration. Along with bread, beer, and garlic, they helped fuel the laborers who hauled limestone under the desert sun. One hieroglyphic tablet from a worker's village records a complaint: "There is no garlic. There is no onion. There is hunger." These weren't luxuries. These were staples. Medicinal, nutritional, spiritual. Onions appeared in religious offerings as well. In temple inventories, onions were listed alongside incense, myrrh, and bread. They were placed before statues of the gods, especially in healing shrines. In the city of Memphis, a temple to Ptah, the god of craftsmen and creation, received regular offerings of onions. Ptah was associated with healing, and onions, often called medicine for the poor, were a humble but powerful gift. Cultivation and culinary use. While not native to the Nile Valley, onions were cultivated extensively in ancient Egypt, likely introduced through trade from the Levant or Central Asia centuries before. The flood cycle of the Nile, so crucial to Egyptian agriculture, created fertile soil ideal for growing onions. They were typically planted in raised beds and harvested by hand. Wall paintings show farmers bending over fields, pulling onions by their long green stalks, baskets beside them. They were one of the few plants that could be eaten in almost any form: roasted whole, chopped into stews, or eaten raw. Even the green tops were used like chives. Despite their ubiquity, onions weren't universally loved. Some religious sects considered them too pungent for sacred rituals. The priesthood of Amun, for instance, sometimes prohibited their consumption during specific festivals, fearing that their smell might offend the gods or disrupt spiritual purity. Still, the people, especially the poor, ate onions daily. They were a staple of workmen, soldiers, and farmers. Tomb illustrations show banquets with fish, bread, and a pile of onions in the center. And unlike more expensive offerings like meat or incense, the onion was both sacred and democratic. It bridged the temples and the fields. Trade and economy. Onions were not just food or medicine. They were a form of currency. Records show that they were used in bartering, especially among the lower classes. In some temple districts, onions were collected as part of taxes in kind. A portion of a farmer's onion crop might be required as tribute. This, in turn, was used to feed priests' workers or redistributed in local rations. While not as valuable as wheat or flax, onions were essential in a parallel economy. A basket of onions could be traded for beer or cloth. For the landless laborer, they were a kind of edible coin. By the New Kingdom period, see year 1550-1070 BCE, Egypt's influence had expanded to the Levant and beyond. With it, onions spread, both as a crop and as a symbol. In Canaanite and Hittite cities, Egyptian-style tombs sometimes included onions or images of them. Whether as trade goods or cultural influence, the onion walked with the Egyptian caravan, from Gaza to Byblos, a symbol woven into life as you drift through the silent tombs and sun-baked fields of ancient Egypt. You begin to notice something. The onion isn't just an object, it is a thread, woven through medicine, worship, agriculture, death, and survival. It is the kind of artifact that seems unremarkable on first glance, but upon closer inspection, reveals itself as essential. What other vegetable can claim such a presence in both surgery and sanctity? What other food walked with kings into the afterlife and with laborers into the noonday sun? The onion, unassuming and pungent, is not just a part of the Egyptian story. It is a lens through which we can view the subtle power of everyday objects, those small things that shape civilization without seeking the spotlight. But how did this sacred vegetable fall from reverence into ordinary obscurity? And what did later civilizations inherit from Egypt's onion-laden legacy? The scent of power, onions in Egyptian medicine, myth and legacy. In the hush of an ancient Egyptian infirmary, where clay jars lined the walls and the air smelled faintly of oils and herbs, the onion often made its entrance not in a dish, but in a mortar, crushed and pulped for healing. And it wasn't alone. Alongside it were pomegranates, coriander, honey, and natron. But the onion held a special place, not just for its availability or sting, but for something deeper. It worked. In this section, we step further into the medical and symbolic heart of ancient Egypt's onion lore. We'll explore how its properties were harnessed by healers, how myths and rituals elevated its role, and how the pungent bulb echoed into future empires and emulated practices. Ancient medical knowledge. The onion's role in healing Egyptian medicine is often admired for its surprising complexity. While much of it was intertwined with magic and religious ritual, many of its practices, like cleanliness, surgical instruments, and herbal remedies, were remarkably empirical. Among the oldest and most significant sources of this knowledge is the Immerse papyrus, which, as mentioned earlier, contains hundreds of remedies. But onions were not limited to just that scroll. They appear in multiple medical papyri, including the Hearst papyrus, dating to the 16th century BCE, which details external and internal treatments. The Berlin papyrus, which records a collection of gynecological and pediatric remedies, many involving onion extracts. The Cahun gynecological papyrus, believed to be among the oldest known medical texts focused on women's health, features onions prominently in treatments related to fertility. For example, one remedy for toothache involved onion juice, beer, and ochre applied to the gums. For digestive complaints, onion broth mixed with cumin was prescribed. To treat infections or abscesses, onions were mashed with honey, a combination still effective due to both ingredients' antimicrobial properties. Some of the onion treatments involved rituals. In one gynecological test for fertility, a peeled onion was placed in a woman's vagina overnight. If her breath smelled of onion the next morning, it was believed her reproductive channels were open and she was fertile. A strange idea, but perhaps based on rudimentary knowledge of the body's connectedness. These examples show that while the logic may not always align with modern biology, There was a keen awareness of cause, effect, and remedy. Observational medicine, born of generations of trial and error. Onions weren't just used in cases of illness. They were often preventative, taken to stimulate appetite, clear the bowels, or sharpen the senses. Soldiers in the Egyptian army were issued onions along with garlic to maintain strength and ward off disease. Workers and craftsmen received similar rations, a kind of ancient healthcare system grounded in kitchen ingredients. And while elite physicians treated the pharaohs and nobles, midwives and local healers used onions just as frequently, often with more direct experience in dealing with childbirth, infections, and day-to-day survival. Sacred stench. Onions in ritual and myth. Egyptians saw health and illness not just as physical conditions, but as spiritual states. Disease could be a punishment, a sign of imbalance, or the work of evil spirits. Healing then required more than medicine. It required purification, incantation, and sometimes onions. Onions were thought to ward off demons and protect the soul. Their strong scent, sharp, almost biting, was considered repellent to evil forces. This belief was not uniquely Egyptian. Other ancient cultures, including the Babylonians and Greeks, also attributed protective powers to pungent herbs and vegetables, but the Egyptians formalized it. In some healing rituals, onions were burned or waved under the nose of the afflicted. This wasn't just to test consciousness, as some modern historians have guessed, but to expel evil through the nostrils, believed to be a key spiritual passage. In temple rituals, onions were used to anoint statues, protect sacred spaces, and even purify the air. When priests entered inner sanctums, they sometimes wore garlands of onions and garlic. The smell, while unpleasant to modern sensibilities, was a symbolic barrier between them and malevolent forces. One myth, albeit lesser known, connects the onion to the god Set, often depicted as the embodiment of chaos. In some regional cults, onions were used in counter-rituals to resist Set's disorder and reaffirm harmony. Mayat. While not universal across Egypt, these localized practices reveal how even vegetables could enter the mythic domain. Meanwhile, funerary practices elevated the onion's symbolism. Mummies wrapped with onions weren't simply preserved better. They were thought to be armed for the journey ahead, a strong scent for a strong soul. In Abydos, the cult center of Osiris, onions were occasionally offered at altars during the Feast of the Valley, a festival of the dead. Though not as common as bread or beer, their presence in ritual records hints at a broader spiritual significance. Daily life, personal beliefs, and folk remedies. The onion's role wasn't limited to the temples or the doctor's tent. It was more than anything a fixture of the home. In Egyptian homes, onions hung from doorways to ward off disease. They were tied in bunches with linen thread and placed near cribs to protect infants from spirits. Housewives mashed onions into paste to apply to insect bites or rubbed roasted bulbs on sore joints. It was knowledge passed through generations, part of a domestic wisdom unrecorded by scribes but preserved through tradition. Even birth and death involved onions. Midwives kept dried onions in their kits. Women in labor might chew raw onion to encourage heat and strength. When someone died, a cut onion was sometimes placed under the body, perhaps to delay decay or to ease the soul's departure. And in the marketplace, onions were more than food. They were gossip fodder. One humorous papyrus fragment from Deir el-Medina jokes that the man who sells onions cannot keep secrets, a jab at either the seller's talkativeness or the onion's tendency to make people cry. Echoes across time, from Egypt to empires. The New Kingdom expanded Egypt's influence. Onion practices traveled with it. Egyptian-trained physicians were dispatched to royal courts across the ancient Near East. In Hittite Anatolia, Canaan, and Nubia, Local healing traditions absorbed Egyptian ingredients and techniques. The Greeks, later conquerors of Egypt under Alexander the Great, took note. While they often mocked Egyptian rituals, they adopted many of their medical practices. Hippocrates himself, the so-called father of medicine, recommended onions as a diuretic and wound dressing. The Romans went further. They cultivated onions extensively and recognized their antiseptic power. Roman soldiers, like their Egyptian predecessors, ate onions as part of their rations. Pliny the Elder praised onions in his Natural History, noting their healing potential and long-standing association with vitality. Even after Egypt's decline as an independent kingdom, its onion legacy endured. Coptic Christian communities in late antiquity continued to use onion-based remedies, and Islamic physicians in medieval Cairo preserved and expanded upon earlier Egyptian knowledge. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, writing in the 10th century, recommended onions for digestion and skin ailments, echoing remedies from thousands of years earlier. By the time onions spread into Europe during the Middle Ages, they were already steeped in centuries of healing tradition, and though much of that tradition was no longer explicitly Egyptian, its roots were unmistakable. Layers of belief and practice. So much of history is lost in silence. The unspoken customs, the worn hands of women mashing herbs, the flick of a priest's wrist as he lays a bulb on an altar. These things rarely make it into official records, but onions, persistent as they are pungent, leave clues in tomb paintings and papyri, in preserved bulbs from ancient graves, and in the practices that outlived their origin. We can trace the story of a vegetable that mattered. To the Egyptians, the onion was more than food. It was medicine, protector, currency, and symbol. It cured the body, guarded the spirit, and fed the soul. But eventually, even the sacred onion was demoted, relegated to kitchens, forgotten altars, and the edges of memory. So what happened when onions met modern science? And how does the legacy of Egypt's healing bulb survive in today's world, often without us even realizing it? The scent of power. The afterlife of the onion in science and culture history, when viewed through the long lens, is often about echoes, moments that resound across centuries, sometimes so subtly that we don't notice the repetition. The ancient Egyptian onion is one of those echoes. From sacred bulb to side dish, its role has changed dramatically, but its legacy surprisingly hasn't faded. In fact, many of the ways we think about health, medicine, and protection still carry traces of this small, tear-inducing vegetable. In this final section, we explore the onion's journey beyond the ancient Nile into the laboratories of modern medicine, the folklore of diverse cultures, and the quiet ways it still influences how we eat, heal, and protect ourselves, even if we no longer leave them on altars or tuck them into tombs. The onion enters the age of science. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as modern medicine began to emerge from the shadow of humoral theory and spiritual medicine, the onion was both respected and ridiculed. Apothecaries still used onion-based tinctures, but professional physicians seeking respectability sometimes dismissed such folk remedies. And yet, when pressed, they often turned to the onion in times of crisis. During the Black Death and later outbreaks of plague and cholera, onions were worn around the neck or placed in homes to absorb poison from the air. This was based on the miasma theory, the idea that disease came from bad smells or foul air. While this theory was incorrect in its fundamentals, the practice itself wasn't entirely foolish. Onions do contain sulfur compounds that have antibacterial properties. In rural Europe and parts of the Ottoman Empire, healers used onion poultices to treat chest infections, abscesses, and inflammation. A cut onion placed under the bed of a sick person was thought to draw out the illness. These beliefs echoed ancient Egyptian practices almost verbatim. It wasn't until the 20th century, with the development of microbiology and biochemistry, that science began to validate some of these ancient claims. Researchers identified key compounds in onions: allicin, quercetin, and sulfur-containing amino acids, with proven antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory effects. In one study during World War I, soldiers used onion juice to disinfect wounds in the absence of antiseptics. And in World War II, similar techniques were used in rural field hospitals where supplies were scarce. These were not placebos. They worked, at least in part. Even today, some over-the-counter natural cold remedies feature onion extracts, albeit under less evocative names. The layers of ancient knowledge, sifted through centuries of skepticism and rediscovery, remain. The onion in folk belief and ritual across the world. Though the ancient Egyptians may have been among the first to ritualize the onion, they were not the last. The onion traveled with traders, migrants, and soldiers. It rooted itself in kitchens and customs from India to Ireland. In Hindu tradition, onions are often restricted or avoided during certain religious festivals, and by some Brahmin communities, not because they are unclean, but because they are seen as too passion-stirring. Their pungency was thought to disturb inner balance during meditation, a belief that mirrors the Egyptian idea of onions as spiritually potent. In Eastern Europe, onions were placed on windowsills and hung above doorways to ward off the evil eye. In Ireland, children with whooping cough were sometimes treated by passing them over a steaming pot of onion water, while prayers were whispered, a blend of Catholic ritual and pre-Christian healing. In Mexico, the curandera, folk healer, tradition uses onions in limpias, spiritual cleansings, to sweep away illness or bad luck. Sliced onions are rubbed over the body, then discarded outside, far from the home. This practice is not unlike ancient Egyptian protective rituals. Even in modern American folklore during the 1918 flu pandemic, stories circulated that placing onions in the room would prevent infection. These claims resurfaced during COVID-19, though often dismissed as superstition. Yet again, the thread leads back to the Nile. It's not that onions are magical, but their longevity in belief systems tells us something about the human need to feel in control of unseen forces, especially illness. A strong scent, a sharp sting. These are things we can grasp when microbes are too small to see. From sacred vegetable to kitchen staple today, onions are everywhere. They're one of the most consumed vegetables on Earth, grown on every continent except Antarctica. Yet few people think of their cultural history, let alone their sacred past. We dice them for stir-fries, caramelize them for French onion soup, and fry them into rings. Their medicinal associations have faded into the background of convenience, yet they still contribute to our health in ways we don't always recognize. Onions are rich in antioxidants. They contain flavonoids and polyphenols that support heart health, and prebiotic fibers that nourish beneficial gut bacteria. They reduce inflammation, improve circulation, and may even help regulate blood sugar levels. When we feel a cold coming on and turn to warm soup laced with onions, we are, consciously or not, participating in a tradition that spans millennia. Not just culinary comfort, but physiological healing. In some corners of the world, the sacred onion still retains a shimmer of mystery. In parts of Ethiopia, India, and Iran, certain religious or seasonal festivals continue to feature onion offerings. In rural Japan, elderly women sometimes place sliced onions near the bed of a sick relative, not with a scientific explanation, but with an ancestral trust in the old ways. Even now, cosmetic and pharmaceutical companies are studying onion compounds for skin repair creams, hair loss treatments, and anti-inflammatory gels. The idea that a humble bulb could repair wounds or restore balance, once myth, now medicine. The legacy of a vegetable. When archaeologists uncover ancient tombs, they often find the grand artifacts: gold, ivory, fine linen. But alongside these, preserved in desiccated baskets or under the folds of wrappings, are onions, wrinkled, brown, barely recognizable, but still intact, still present. The pharaohs may have believed onions protected their journey through the underworld, and perhaps in some quiet way they were right. The onion did cross the ages, not by magic but by utility. It survived, and in surviving, it became part of something bigger. It became part of medicine, of belief, of memory. The onion teaches us that history isn't always shaped by battles or kings, but by what people ate, what they believed, and how they tried to survive. It's a story of human resilience, layered and tear-stained, yes, but enduring. So the next time you peel an onion and tears sting your eyes, remember, someone in ancient Egypt once cried over the same scent. Maybe they were curing a wound, maybe they were saying goodbye to a loved one, or maybe they believed that each translucent ring, circling inward without end, was a reminder of life's quiet strength and the mystery at its core. The scribal economy. How ancient accountants measured empires in grain. Let us begin with a curious scene. Not a battlefield, not a royal court, but a small, dusty room in an ancient administrative outpost, somewhere along the floodplain of the Nile. The walls are plastered with symbols, neatly written lines of hieratic script or wedge-shaped cuneiform impressions pressed into wet clay. There is no gold, no fanfare, no grand architecture, just silence, and the soft scratch of a reed pen on papyrus. The man sitting at the low wooden desk is not a priest or warrior. He is a scribe, and his duty today is to count bags of barley. This is not the history you often hear about. There are no famous battles to recount, no grand monuments to describe. But if we wish to understand how early civilizations functioned, how they fed their people, paid their workers, built their cities, then we must learn to appreciate the people who counted grain. This is the story of how ancient empires from Egypt to Mesopotamia ran not on gold or glory but on records, carefully tracked, endlessly duplicated, and meticulously stored. It is the story of the scribes, the ancient accountants, whose quiet work ensured the survival of entire societies. What is measured can be managed before coins jingled in the marketplace or paper notes passed from hand to hand. Wealth was measured in food, and the most vital foodstuff of the early empires was grain. Wheat, barley, millet, emmer. It was not merely a source of sustenance, it was currency, tax base, salary, and storage for the future. To control grain was to control power. Yet grain is perishable, scattered across seasons and regions. Without a way to measure, store, and track it, there could be no stable civilization. This is where scribes came in. In the river valleys of the Fertile Crescent, around 3000 BCE, early city-states like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon began to produce a class of professionals whose entire job was to record the flow of goods. They were literate when most people were not. They trained for years in the temple schools, learning how to shape styluses and press intricate cuneiform marks into clay tablets. They were not inventing language. Oral traditions already existed, but they were inventing record-keeping systems. And those systems were not for poetry or philosophy, they were for accounts. The earliest surviving examples of writing are lists, tallies of sheep, allocations of beer, deliveries of bricks. The legendary Epic of Gilgamesh would come later. First came the daily inventory, barley as salary, temples as banks. In ancient Mesopotamia, the state and the temple functioned as an employer. Workers, whether laborers digging canals, guards at city gates, or servants of the god, were often paid in rations of barley and beer. These were not just casual handouts, they were part of an intricate bureaucratic apparatus. Let us imagine a woman named Kalama working as a weaver in the temple workshop of the goddess Inanna in Uruk. Every month her name would be inscribed, On a ration tablet, along with the number of sela of barley, a unit roughly equivalent to a liter, she was due. A temple scribe would record the allocation, and if Kalama had children, their rations would be noted too. Perhaps she received 60 sila of barley and 5 sila of beer per month. This was her compensation, not just for her work, but for her role in the tightly structured economic system. And if the barley failed to arrive, that failure would not be viewed as a simple administrative error. It would be a break in the social contract. Grain was how the state fulfilled its obligations. It was a promise. Thus, the scribes were not merely clerks. They were guardians of the economic system, and they worked in conditions both dusty and political. The power of pen and seal scribes wielded tools that could reshape fortunes. Their pens, a stylus made from reed or bone, could determine how much a farmer owed in tax, how many bricks a builder delivered, or whether a worker received enough to eat. The seal, a carved cylinder used to stamp a signature into clay, carried legal weight. Once impressed onto a tablet, it transformed a document into binding authority. Scribes often worked under the supervision of higher officials, but had considerable latitude. A misplaced mark, a slight alteration in quantity, could mean the difference between abundance and hardship. Over time, this system grew in complexity. Entire archives of ration tablets were created, some stacked in clay jars, others sealed and stored in state repositories. In the city of Nippur, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of tablets from temple granaries, some over 4,000 years old. They include names, dates, amounts, and destinations. It is, in essence, a bureaucratic fossil. And what do these records show? They show a world where everything was counted. Donkeys, baskets, bundles of reeds, meals provided to messengers, loans of barley with interest. Even time itself, as in, the brickmaker has been absent for 3 days. His rations are to be reduced. This was a society ruled by record. Egypt and the grain economy of the Nile. While Mesopotamia was pressing clay, Egypt was writing on papyrus, using hieratic script, a faster, more functional form of hieroglyphics. The Nile's predictable flooding made agriculture more stable, but the need for organized administration remained immense. Grain storage in ancient Egypt was a monumental task. Surpluses from the harvest had to be gathered into granaries, then redistributed to temples, officials, workers, and the military. Here too, scribes formed the administrative backbone. The title, scribe of the granary, was a respected one, often passed down within families. These officials recorded not only how much grain was stored, but its moisture content, type, and quality. Papyrus documents from the Ramesside period, c. 1300 BCE, contained tables of daily grain expenditures, forecasts for shortfalls, and proposed reallocations. When the pyramids were built, laborers were not paid in coins or stones. They were paid in bread and beer, both made from grain. The logistical operations required to move grain from fields to granaries to workers were complex, and scribes coordinated it all. To them, grain was not simply food. It was value, and their records were the circulatory system of the state. Why? The boring matters. It is tempting to skip over these lists and tables in ancient records. They seem dull, repetitive, obsessive, but in doing so, we miss what they tell us, that civilizations are not only built on war and glory, but on the quiet, relentless act of counting. A single mistake in grain allocation could mean hunger for hundreds. A well-kept ledger ensured stability. The scribe, sitting in a mud brick room with a pot of ink or a slab of clay, held the fate of villages in his pen. He did not wear a crown. He did not command armies, but his work outlived empires. The tablets and scrolls they left behind, full of barley counts, tax notices, and food lists, may not thrill like a battle narrative, but they allow us to see how these societies really functioned, not at their peaks, but in their daily grind. And so we must ask, if grain was the foundation of ancient power, and scribes were the ones who measured it, then were they not the true architects of empire? The scribal economy. When numbers became power in the first section, we trace the ancient scribes' essential role in managing grain, the lifeblood of early empires. These record keepers, often overlooked by history in favor of kings and conquerors, quietly built the infrastructure that allowed civilizations to survive. But numbers once written down begin to take on power of their own. In this section, we turn to how scribes evolved from simple accountants into state bureaucrats, land surveyors, tax collectors, and even political advisors. Their quiet control over information and their ability to manipulate it meant that some scribes shaped more than grain flows. They helped shape society itself. The rise of the bureaucratic class. As ancient states expanded, so too did their administrative needs. Counting sacks of barley was only the beginning. Soon scribes were needed to record land ownership, legal contracts, military supplies, and temple assets. In Mesopotamia, palace economies became increasingly complex, with overlapping layers of authority and obligation. In Egypt, entire bureaucracies were established to manage the pharaoh's estate, the temple's holdings, and provincial governors' obligations. The scribe class evolved into a full administrative elite. These were literate men and occasionally women, who could interpret and execute the will of rulers, often by drafting legal texts or issuing orders. In some societies, scribes became so powerful that they acted as the state's memory. Consider a royal edict issued by a pharaoh. The spoken word of the ruler was powerful, but only once recorded by a scribe did it become binding. If no record was made, or if the scribe chose to interpret it differently, the order might be delayed, altered, or forgotten altogether. This dynamic made literacy a tool of power, and those who held the pen in many ways held the keys to the kingdom. The land beneath the pen, cadastral surveys and taxation, to manage the distribution of grain and goods. States needed to know how much land was under cultivation, who owned it, and what it produced. This necessity gave rise to some of the earliest land survey systems, and once again, scribes were at the center. In ancient Egypt, the flooding of the Nile reset the agricultural landscape every year. Land boundaries were often washed away and had to be re-established. Scribes worked alongside surveyors, or rope stretchers, to remeasure fields, document ownership, and assess tax liabilities. These assessments were carefully recorded in land registers, some of which have survived on papyrus scrolls. A tax might be assessed in grain, livestock, or labor, and the amounts owed were recorded with great precision. In Mesopotamia, temple estates often leased land to farmers, and scribes documented the terms of lease, the expected yields, and the penalties for shortfalls. Some even noted crop rotation patterns, seasonal labor obligations, or the use of irrigation. One preserved tablet from ancient Lagash records that Allah Ili has been granted 6 EQ, about 2 acres, of barley field. He must deliver 120 sila of barley at harvest. If he failed, additional labor or livestock could be seized as penalty. The entire state economy, in essence, rested on accurate record keeping. Without the scribes' meticulous work, taxation would be chaotic, and resource planning impossible. Literacy and social status. The path to becoming a scribe was difficult, but rewarding. In Egypt, students began their training as young boys, often in scribal schools attached to temples or government offices. They practiced writing hieratic script using water and broken pottery sherds before graduating to ink and papyrus. Copying proverbs, letters, and ledgers, they built muscle memory and mental discipline. Some texts from these schools survive, giving us an almost comical window into scribal life. One student exercise, likely written under pressure, reads, "A donkey is my writing board, my feet my inkwell. The teacher beats me, the boys jeer, but I must finish the lines before breakfast." Another student scrawled a line repeatedly. "The scribe is greater than the plowman." It was not just punishment, it was indoctrination. The pen, they were told, was nobler than the sword or the hoe. And it was. Scribes were exempt from many forms of labor. They received rations, clothing, and housing. They could rise to high administrative posts or serve as advisors to rulers. Their skill in reading and writing gave them influence over those who could not. A majority of the population, even in Mesopotamia, where literacy was more widespread among the elite, the ability to navigate the legal and numerical language of tablets was rare. Scribes became intermediaries not just between government and people, but between past and present. A contract written today might govern actions 20 years hence, making the scribe a guardian of future justice. When records go wrong, manipulation, and fraud with great responsibility comes the opportunity for abuse. Not all scribes were upright civil servants. Like modern accountants or bureaucrats, they could manipulate records for personal gain or political reasons. In a legal document from 13th century BCE Egypt, a temple scribe is accused of under-recording harvest yields so he could pocket surplus grain. A Mesopotamian lawsuit from the city of Sippar describes a case where two brothers contested the terms of a lease, claiming the original scribe altered the figures in favor of one family. The clay tablets do not lie, but the hands that shaped them sometimes did. This kind of administrative fraud could be subtle or massive. In times of famine, altering inventory records might preserve someone's life, or doom another to starvation. During wartime, misreporting troop provisions could determine the outcome of a campaign. The stakes were high. Some rulers, aware of this, tried to increase transparency. In Babylon, King Hammurabi's famous law code included strict penalties for fraudulent record-keeping. In Assyria, officials conducted audits and reviewed scribal archives to prevent embezzlement. But enforcement was inconsistent, and the scribes remained essential even when they were imperfect. From grain tallies to literature, interestingly, it was often these same scribes who, once their daily duties were completed, turned to more creative pursuits. Many of the earliest literary texts, epics, hymns, wisdom literature, were copied or composed by scribes. In Egypt, a popular genre was the instructions, or advice texts written from father to son. One example, the Instructions of Kagemni, includes practical wisdom such as, "Do not fill yourself with bread if you do not know your companion's hunger." Another, the Satire of the Trades, humorously elevates the scribe's job above all others. The potter stinks of the mud. The soldier dies in war, but the scribe is clothed in white and sits in the shade. In Mesopotamia, scribes copied the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's earliest known literary epic. They preserved court poetry, temple songs, and even riddles. These literary works gave scribes cultural legitimacy beyond their economic roles. They were not only calculators of grain, but curators of civilization, preserving ideas and identities across centuries. Bureaucracy as legacy. The great irony of scribal labor is that much of it was never meant to be remembered. Daily inventories, ration lists, lease contracts, these were intended to solve immediate problems, and yet they are what survive. When archaeologists excavated the city of Mari, they found an archive of over 25,000 clay tablets buried under collapsed buildings. Some recorded grand events, diplomatic exchanges, royal edicts, but most detailed grain shipments, meat portions, or clothing rations. In their sheer volume and detail, these documents paint a picture of ancient life more vivid than any tomb, painting or king's decree. We know what people ate, what they owed, when they were late, and who owed them compensation. It is not romantic, but it is real. The scribes did not seek fame, They sought order, and in doing so they gave us a window into the machinery of ancient life, the scribal economy, collapse and inheritance. In the first two sections we explored how ancient scribes, those often forgotten technicians of the pen, quietly built the infrastructure of early civilizations. From measuring barley to drafting royal edicts, these literate elites kept empires functioning sometimes more securely than the rulers themselves. Yet all systems, no matter how meticulously recorded, eventually fray, and so too did the scribal order. In this final section we examine what happened when the bureaucratic system scribes relied upon began to unravel, whether through environmental collapse, military invasion, or political upheaval. The scribes of antiquity often found themselves both witnesses to and victims of civilizational decline, but their tools and the habits of record-keeping they forged did not vanish. They were inherited, altered, adapted, and absorbed by future civilizations. The bureaucratic mind, once born, proved remarkably hard to kill. The fragile machines of empire ancient states were not as permanent as they once seemed. Drought, disease, war, and internal corruption all posed significant threats to empires dependent on centralized control. In Mesopotamia, the fall of Ur-III around 2004 BCE was one such example. This dynasty had invested heavily in administrative oversight, producing thousands of tablets each year. Its rulers, especially Shulgi, a king who described himself as king of righteousness, centralized production, redistributed grain, and implemented a standard legal code. Scribes managed elaborate bureaucracies with impressive efficiency, but they could not control the weather. A prolonged drought, paired with external invasions by Elamites and Amorites, disrupted trade and food supply. As grain yields shrank, so did the scribes' power to allocate resources. Temples that once received thousands of bushels now went hungry. The once smooth system of rationing began to break down. Records describe abandoned storehouses and scribes fleeing their posts. In a haunting tablet written just after the empire's collapse, a former official laments, "The barley is gone, the oxen are gone, the city walls are empty, and no one comes to weigh the grain." Scribes, it turned out, could manage scarcity, but not catastrophe. Egypt's 12th dynasty, a golden age and its slow decline. Meanwhile, in Egypt's Middle Kingdom, the scribal class reached new heights. During the 12th dynasty, circa 1991 or 1802 BCE, kings such as Senusret III and Amenemhat III expanded the bureaucracy dramatically. Scribes were appointed not only in the Nile Valley, but deep into Nubia, where Egyptian fortresses required daily inventory logs, food shipments, and labor reports. These scribes operated in a world of extraordinary predictability. The Nile's annual flood remained stable. The central state was strong. Taxes flowed. For a time, it seemed the scribal economy had achieved a perfect balance, but that too changed. By the end of the 12th dynasty, Egypt began to experience increased regional autonomy, weakening central rule, and rising incursions from foreign peoples. The centralized administrative system, so dependent on reliable hierarchies, struggled to respond. When the Hyksos seized power in the Nile Delta, many state institutions fragmented. Still, scribes adapted. Rather than disappearing, they often shifted allegiance, recording taxes for new rulers or overseeing grain distribution for regional warlords. Some became part of temple networks where religious institutions preserved literacy, even in times of political chaos. These temples became semi-independent centers of governance where scribes kept time, charted the stars, and recorded offerings. Long after royal edicts ceased, in this way the scribe outlived the state. Scribes in transition, from clay to papyrus, from temples to empires. As civilizations changed, So did their tools. Cuneiform, once the global language of administration, gradually fell out of favor. Around the first millennium BCE, alphabetic scripts became more widespread. Phoenician traders, with their simplified writing system, influenced the emergence of Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew scripts, each of which could be learned more easily than cuneiform, which required mastering hundreds of signs. This shift democratized literacy slightly, but even with simpler scripts, scribes retained a specialized role. In Persian, Assyrian, and Babylonian empires, scribes served in multilinguistic courts, translating texts and creating vast bureaucratic archives. The Achaemenid Empire, stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, employed scribes from every corner of the empire. Their records were sometimes written in Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, or Aramaic. A tablet from Persepolis, for instance, records 3 sheep, 2 goats, and 1 bull sent to the workmen at the northern quarry. Another, dated to 509 BCE, mentions wine rations for the scribes who prepared the stone lists. Despite changes in regime and language, the scribal impulse to count, to record, remained intact. Survival through redundancy. One might expect that with each empire's collapse, scribal records would vanish entirely, and indeed, many did. Yet some systems were designed with redundancy in mind. For example, in Mesopotamia, it was common to create multiple copies of contracts, some of which were stored with different parties or in sealed clay envelopes. In the event of fraud or destruction, the truth could be reconstructed. This method of archival resilience was crucial for long-term trust. Even today, we find envelope tablets that still hold their sealed inner contracts, unread for 4,000 years. Temples and palaces often stored copies of treaties, legal codes, and tax ledgers in protected archives. In Ugarit, a small kingdom, destroyed around 1200 BCE, scribes had compiled texts in 4 different languages: Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, and Ugaritic. Though the city fell to invading forces, the tablets were preserved under ash and rubble, giving us a multilingual snapshot of an administrative world on the brink of collapse. It is ironic that the very disasters that ended scribal civilizations also preserved their legacy. The scribe's modern inheritance. What does this mean for us today? The scribes of antiquity may feel distant from the digital world, yet their systems, registers, ledgers, standardized forms, remain deeply embedded in modern life. When you fill out a tax form, log into a payroll system, or sign a lease, you're engaging with tools once pioneered by ancient administrators in linen kilts and reed sandals. Even the idea of a career bureaucrat, someone who serves across multiple regimes and upholds institutional memory, has roots in the scribal tradition. The modern civil service owes much to these early functionaries who valued continuity over charisma, procedure over performance. More profoundly, the scribes remind us that the mundane can be monumental. A receipt for beer rations, a list of donkey assignments, or a tally of bricks might seem boring, but they formed the arteries through which civilization pulsed. In that way, history doesn't live in grand speeches or statues alone. It lives in the dusty accounting of grain, a quiet, enduring power. As we close this story, imagine an aging scribe in ancient Babylon. The king is dead. The temple has been looted. War is coming. Still, the scribe sits at a desk of packed earth, smoothing a lump of clay, inscribing with care 3 measures of barley, received from Enlil-Bani, delivered to the storehouse, sealed by Sheshgala. He doesn't know that his empire is ending. He doesn't know that thousands of years later, a student in London or Kyoto or Cairo will read those lines. He only knows the value of a record made honestly, and in that quiet act he preserves a civilization. How ancient trade created empires and outposts. You may not have thought much about salt today, Perhaps a sprinkle on your food, or maybe a moment's glance at the little shaker beside your stove. But salt was once more precious than gold, more guarded than a king's treasure, and more essential than most gods in the daily rituals of ancient life. It preserved fish before refrigerators existed. It determined the reach of armies and caravans, and it shaped the very rise and fall of cities. Entire empires rose not from conquest, but from the gentle, patient movement of salt, grain by grain, sack by sack, across deserts, rivers, and mountains. This is a story of the salt roads, not just physical paths carved by trade, but the invisible veins through which ancient economies pulsed. Let's begin where the desert meets the sea, where salt dried into crusted plains and nomads harvested wealth that did not grow from the ground. Let us begin in ancient North Africa, the Sahara's white gold long before trans-Saharan camel caravans were common. Salt was already being mined and traded across northern Africa. One of the earliest centers of salt production can be found in Tagaza, a now abandoned village in modern-day Mali. Situated in the heart of the Sahara, it was a forbidding place. No fresh water, no vegetation, just the sound of wind shifting over dunes and the scrape of tools on salt slabs. Here, salt didn't just season food. It was food, because without it people died. In the dry climates of the Sahara and Sahel, sweat loss was immense and salt intake was essential. Cattle needed it. Humans needed it. Salt cakes served not only as commodities but also as currency, exchanged measure for gold, millet, and even slaves. The Berber-speaking traders of the north were some of the first to recognize the commercial value of these salt deposits. For generations they loaded slabs of salt, each the size of a tabletop, onto camels and trudged across punishing terrain to exchange them with West African societies in the Niger River Basin. The city of Timbuktu, which would later become a beacon of scholarship, began as a waypoint for salt and gold traders. So did Gao, Jenne, and Walata. These cities, dry and dusty, lived off the slow, reliable wealth that came with each caravan, and salt, being durable and nearly imperishable, could travel great distances without spoilage. In this sense, it was a perfect pre-modern trade good. Salt in ancient China, the government monopoly. While Africa's salt flowed through caravans, in ancient China, salt became a lever of central control. As early as the spring and autumn period, 74 and 76 BCE, Chinese rulers recognized salt's value and took steps to regulate its production and sale. By the time of the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, salt was fully monopolized by the state, a bureaucratic institution that taxed, weighed, and transported salt under government oversight. Salt was too important to be left to chance. The Han government appointed salt commissioners who ensured local salt works in coastal marshes or inland brine wells met quotas. Bribes, of course, were common, so were smuggling networks. But the state's involvement ensured that salt revenue became one of the largest sources of income for the imperial treasury. Why go to such lengths over something so simple? Because every household needed salt, regardless of status. From the peasant boiling rice in a clay pot to the scholar sipping salted fish broth, this white crystal was universal. Unlike land or silks, which varied in use or value, salt was a constant demand, which made it a perfect vehicle for taxation. In fact, the salt tax was so reliable that later Chinese dynasties, Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing, all retained and expanded salt monopolies. The historian Needham once wrote, The history of China is in part a history of salt, and yet, for all its economic gravity, this salt system operated quietly through ledgers, brine boiling houses, and accounts tallied by government scribes. These were not dramatic events, they were systems, dull, essential, and impossibly enduring. Roman roads, Salaria, and the empire's backbone. Now let us turn westward to the Roman world. Even the word salary, your wages, your livelihood, has its roots in salt. The Latin word salarium refers to the money Roman soldiers received to buy salt, or possibly as compensation partly paid in salt. While the exact mechanism remains debated, the symbolism is undeniable. Salt and service were linked. The Via Salaria, or Salt Road, was one of the earliest Roman roads, used originally by the Sabines and later by Romans, to bring salt from the coast at Ostia inland to settlements in Latium and beyond. Salt in Rome wasn't just consumed, it was used for curing meat, preserving fish, and in religious rituals, especially in purifying offerings and altars. It was considered so vital that wars were fought to secure access to salt pans, particularly along coastal marshes. To the Romans, roads were instruments of conquest, yes, but they were also arteries of commerce, and at the center of that economic bloodstream was salt. Legions marched with salted pork. Merchants packed salted olives in amphorae. Towns near salt sources, such as Salerna and Pisa, grew rapidly due to their ability to provide this vital resource. Unlike the spectacular wealth of gold mines or the glamour of silk, salt wealth was invisible, slow building, and resilient. It did not dazzle, but it endured. Salt and the holy. It wasn't only about diet and commerce. In nearly every ancient culture, salt carried spiritual significance. In Mesopotamia, salt was a key part of purification rituals. Babylonian priests would use it in temple offerings, believing it could ward off evil spirits and cleanse impurities. In Judaism, the covenant of salt symbolized enduring commitment and loyalty. The Hebrew Bible speaks of salt as a symbol of permanence and preservation. Leviticus 2:13 commands that every offering of your grain offering shall you season with salt. The connection between salt and loyalty, between flavor and faith, between food and ritual, echoes across texts and centuries. Even today, to eat salt together, in many cultures, signifies friendship and trust, a bond that transcends transaction, and perhaps that's what makes salt so compelling in history, not just its uses, but its symbolism. Salt is simple, but it means something. The unseen roads in all these places, Saharan salt mines, Chinese marshlands, Roman roads, salt tied people together. It passed from hand to hand, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes packed in crates, sometimes chiseled into slabs and strapped to camelbacks, but it was never flashy. Salt moved slowly. It left no grand monuments. It funded no sprawling palace complexes. Its wealth was not ostentatious but dependable. Cities grew where salt flowed, and withered where it ceased. It is the ultimate boring history, but it may also be one of the most important. So tonight, as you rest, imagine those silent caravans crossing an ocean of sand. Imagine the hands lifting clay pots from boiling brine. Imagine the Roman soldier clutching a salt packet in his belt, walking a road older than the empire itself. And ask yourself this: how many empires rose and fell simply because someone had to eat?